Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to round to the nearest whole number when we're working with decimals. As you see up top here, I love making decimals look like money. Once again, it's relatable, kids understand it. Some of the decimal stuff, not so much yet, but money we get. So I gave them an example number up top here, 34 and 21 hundredths, looks like $34.21. And we talk about how that can be broken into two pieces. It can be broken into its whole number, and it can be broken into its decimal. Basically, it's a mixed number. And we say, think about it like money. When we round to the nearest whole number, we're getting rid of the decimal, which would be the change, and seeing which dollar is closest. So I will relate that to them by saying, when I get your final answer, I don't want to see any change. I don't want to see any cents left over. It should be just a dollar amount. That's what we mean by rounding to the nearest whole number. There is no decimal left. So down below here, we give them a number line to kind of talk about, to walk ourselves through the problem. And at first we go, okay, so there's 34 way down here, 35 right here. So right in the middle, what would be there? And we talk about how when you're a kid you go, well, there's nothing between 34 and 35. But now that we know about decimals, we know there's an entire world in between 34 and 35. So if they still have a hard time thinking about that, I'll say, okay, well, what's between $34 and $35? What would be halfway in between? And inevitably they say $34.50. So we go, okay, we're going to say right about in the middle, $34.50. But we say, since this isn't money, how do we say it? And we'd say 34 and 50 hundredths. Well, after we've established the middle, we look and we go, well, here's the number we're looking at. 34 and 21 hundredths. Where would that be about? And they go, well, 25 cents is going to be about right there, so maybe about right here. And after we have that, all we do is say, okay, well, let's look on the number line and say, what is this closer to? Is $34.21, is that closer to being 34, or is it closer to being 35? And obviously, the distance here, it's a lot closer to being 34, so when we round that, we'd round that to the nearest whole number, and that would be 34. And then we practice some examples down below. And I use 34 over and over again just because it's one that we're familiar with. We've got the number line right here, we can look at it. So this one, remember I've talked about make it look like money or think about money. So this one looks like money. Now I just ask, when we think about the number line up here, is this closer to being 35 or 34? And kids that have a tough time with this, we can use the number line and go, okay, well, that's going to be about right here. And that's closer to being 35. Now we look at the next one. It's $34 and 2 hundredths, and $34 and 2 hundredths. And we look and we go, well, that'd be way down here. So there's 34. And now we get to our first number here that doesn't look like money. And we can go, all right, well, if it helps us right now, obviously we can see this and say it's way up here, 34 and 6/10 would be here. But if you can't see that, we can add that 0, because we've learned that in previous lessons that that doesn't add any value to it. So 34 and 60 hundredths is about right there. That's going to be closer to 35. Now we threw some tricky ones down here at the bottom because we look at this and we go, well, that doesn't look like money at all. A lot of kids see that 55 and they want to round that thing up. And I tell them, well, when you have money, you have dollars and you have cents. And behind the decimal, there should only be 2 numbers. How many numbers do we have behind the decimal? They'll tell me 3. And I say, okay, well, let's just pretend 1 doesn't exist for a minute. Let's just cover that up. That's really $34.05. Well, $34.05 is going to be closer to being 34. And then after we figure that out, I'll tell them what this is basically saying, boys and girls, is this is like $34.05 and then another half penny. So that's kind of how we kind of think about it, still keeping that money thought in place. But I always do that when we go to the thousands place. I will cover that up and say, let's think about it like that when we're rounding. $34.05. That's obviously going to round up to 35. And we talk about how that's the midway point. That one gets rounded up. Anything below it, 34 and 49 hundredths, that's going to get rounded down. And for our last one, add that 0 on, 34 and 70 hundredths. That's going to round up to be 35. and that's rounding numbers to the nearest whole number.